Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. In honor of the 150th birthday of the early 20th century American author Willa Cather, I'm buddy reading several of her novels, as well as a variety of biographies and literary criticism about her work. And today I have the amazing Shawn the Book Maniac with me to talk about Cather's novel, My Antonia. He's the person who inspired me to host some of these buddy reads as filmed discussions. He set a phenomenal model of fantastic discussions with a wide variety of readers. Shawn is a booktube luminary, to use his phrase, and I'm thrilled to be able to share our conversation with you today about this novel. Before we get started, let me give you just a brief setup of what is going on at the beginning of this book. The introduction starts in the voice of an unnamed narrator who runs into an old friend, Jim Burton, who is now a lawyer in New York City, while the two people are riding on a train crossing through Iowa. They reminisce about growing up in a small town on the Nebraska prairie and about some of the people they knew there, including a young bohemian immigrant named Antonia Shimerda. More than another person we remembered, writes the narrator, quote, "This girl seemed to mean to us the country, the conditions, the whole adventure of our childhood. To speak her name was to call up pictures of people and places, to set a quiet drama going in one's brain." And after their conversation on the train, the narrator challenges Jim to write up his memories of Antonia, and she promises that she will write up her memories as well. He warns her that his story will be quite personal, the story of how he thought about her, how he remembered her. The narrator responds, "I told him that how he knew her and felt her was exactly what I wanted most to know about Antonia." A few months later, Jim Burton gives his manuscript of memories to the narrator. At first, the document is untitled, but before he lets go of it, he writes Antonia on the front page. And after a brief pause, he adds the word my before her name. My Antonia. The next chapter starts in the voice of a young Jim, talking about when he first met Antonia, also on a train passing through the prairie, when he was about 10 years old. And she was just a couple of years older than he was. Okay, let's get on to the conversation with Shawn. Hello, Shawn. It's great to have you here today.
What a special treat to be collaborating with you,
I'm
Hannah.
really looking forward to talking about Willa Cather's My Antonia. Tell me a little bit about your history with Cather. This is the first time you've read this book, right?
Well, I think so. So my history with Cather is that I took a graduate English course on James Wharton and Cather. And while it was my favorite course of all the courses I took, I had such a terrible experience at grad school that I kind of zoned out halfway through the year. So I don't think I read this. It was probably on the syllabus, but I was kind of tuned out. And in fact, that left me because I hated grad school so much. I had a Willa Cather allergy until maybe about a year ago, where I finally read a novella of hers. I believe it's called The Lost Lady,
Oh, yes.
and it finally cured me because I enjoyed it. And then I absolutely loved this. So this has been very healing for me, Hannah, among many other reactions I've had to it.
Wonderful.
How
Wonderful.
about you?
I loved it too. I first read this, I think I was in my early 20s, probably, just for fun, not for school. My mother was an English professor when I was little, and she loved this book, and I remember her talking about it, but I never read it myself. And I've read it a few times over the years, but it's been a while. It's been a while, and it is really, really beautiful. I love Cather's language, especially in this book.
It's so beautifully written that, as my friend and I know that you know her of her interest in Willa Cather, and you're familiar with her Chris Wolak of the
Yes.
Bookcougars podcast. What I got from reading some of her blog entries about it was that yes, it's so beautiful that you almost forget about how violent the story is in so many places.
Hmm. Yes, and I really want to talk about that. Let's start a little bit with how the book starts. I talked in an introduction about what happens, but why do you think Cather chose this kind of narrative style? Why not just have it from Jim's perspective? Why start with this Cather-like figure asking Jim to tell the story?
Yeah. Well, as usual, when I talk about anything, anything that might be brilliant would be accidental, or I've stolen it from somebody else. So I was watching a video today with some learned professors, and one of them, Robert Thacker, he's a Canadian professor. He's written a biography of Alice Munro, but apparently at the time that video was made, I don't know about now, he was the president of the Willa Cather Association.
Oh, wow.
He talked about how really Jim was Willa Cather, but that she couldn't write a novel with a narrator as enamored with Antonia as she was, because apparently it's a very autobiographical story. So she put Jim in as a stand-in, and so she locates herself as the narrator of that curious introduction to the 1918 edition that was
Hmm.
changed significantly and on-gendered in the 1920 whatever 5 revision. Um, but that was his theory, and that makes sense to me.
That's interesting. Certainly, Cather and Jim have some things in common, both moving as children to
Yes.
Nebraska from Virginia. I think that he was from Virginia too. Am I remembering that correctly?
Yes.
It's interesting that she would choose um, a male narrator for the story. Um,
Well, and I think it would be easy to say that that would be a way for her to kind of closet the story. That I don't know too much about the biographical story. It was based on Anna Pavelka, and there's a letter in my as an appendix to my book and I didn't read it. I didn't get a chance to read it. There's a way of closeting the autobiographical aspects of it by putting it in a man's voice, but also it gives her a chance to make some pretty interesting uh, observations on the gender and on men. So both of
yeah.
those, I think.
Let's
Yeah.
talk a little bit about the gender of Antonia herself first. Do you find her compelling?
Oh, absolutely compelling, and probably mostly because she's so not like, well, I guess because she's so much like a prairie girl
Hmm.
back in that day. She was so tomboyish. She just kind of embodies all the themes that Willa Cather is exploring, the immigrant experience and women in the settler societies and the small towns. No, I found her utterly compelling, and I do kind of wonder what would this story have been like if she had been the narrator herself. What would have been the critical reception to a novel narrated by a young immigrant woman, but told through the eyes of a much more traditional white. Um, and back in those days, I don't think they would have considered bohemian people white. To lend some authenticity to the story or something, convey the message that you should be so bigoted about the immigrants in your midst, perhaps. But it's an interesting question, isn't it?
Yeah, I find her such a strong character, but also one who is playful and thoughtful compared to a lot of young, strong characters we get, which maybe fits with other Western, prairie girls.
Yeah, I'm trying to think who I would compare her to. I mean, there's a whiff of kind of an Anne of Green Gables, but I wouldn't go too far down that
Or,
road.
or Laura Ingalls Wilder, even
Oh, and I haven't read those. If I ever read them, I think I just saw the TV show. But yeah, exactly.
a little bit spirited and playful, but also a little tomboy and strong. Um,
Absolutely. Absolutely. No, what a fascinating protagonist.
so, how
Um,
does she change over time?
what a interesting question. I think she changes in a whole bunch of ways. So she arrives on the same train as our narrator, Jim Burden, as children to come out to this little rinky-dink little town in Nebraska, not speaking a word of English, or maybe a couple words is all. and so then she is taught English by his Jim's grandparents and by him. Um, and she soon we soon see that she's indispensable on her family's farm. That she's the one that has kind of the the go-getiveness, if that's a word. It's the kind of common sense wisdom and the muscular power to do just about anything needs to be done on the farm. Um, and then, as a preteen or teenager, she moves into town around the same time that Jim and his grandparents move into the town. And she is, as she comes of age, as she goes into her teenage years, she blossoms and she gets a lot of attention from the men, and there is a lot of social judgment. And one of the things that fascinates me in Willa Cather novels is that the male protagonists are incredibly judgmental about the women, even if they love them or maybe because they love them. And that there was a lot of judgment, both from Jim's perspective, but from a lot of the townspeople about Antonia as she began exploring a social life and a romantic life. And then we see her, of course, at the end as a very busy, very happy mother of something like a dozen children. Yeah.
Oh, one of the reasons I asked the question is because I I've been trying to figure out who was the main character. I mean, clearly both both Antonia and Jim are central characters here. That see it through Jim's eyes, but when I'm trying to figure out who a protagonist is in a book, I'm often thinking about who changes their minds, who has a new insight. And I don't think we ever really see into Antonia's head. And so yes, her life situation definitely changes. But I, while I'm sure that given those life changes, that she must have conceived of who she was differently, we don't get to read that, or we don't see that. We see it only through Jim's eyes.
Yeah, and I think what we do see is her emotional state, her psychological, like we're going to get into a little bit of spoiler territory on occasion, so I think everything up until this point we haven't done that, but I'm going to make a comment now that some of you might not like to find out about if you haven't read the book. So exercise your own judgment. There's interesting hints at Antonia's mental state when she comes home after being abandoned by her fiance, who didn't marry her and left her pregnant. They went off to some nearby city or a bigger town anyway, and then she comes home pregnant and deserted, and makes several remarks that kind of go what's the fate that befell her father. Her father committed suicide, and she seemed like she was in a very desperate state that time. Whereas when we see her 20 years later, she's very satisfied with her life. Or through Jim's eyes, we are made to feel that and as he quotes her, that she's in her element.
I think that the time where she seems like she's suffering mentally and is so sad is relatively subtle. And I don't think I saw it when I read it before, but I certainly noticed it this time
That's right.
that she
It is
um,
very subtle, absolutely. There's a lot of layers to this story.
and not only is she potentially suicidal, but there's so much other suicide in this book. It's a theme that runs throughout, and yet it's quiet, even when it's people that she loves very much or that matter a lot to Jim, even that it's fairly subtle. We see the impacts, and that one scene is of her father's suicide is um,
Pretty graphic and pretty, yeah, we get lots of time. There's a lot of time in those chapters for very detailed descriptions of what his corpse was left looking like, and what Mrs. Schmurda had her kids do it. I'm laughing, but it was horrible.
and that
At the funeral.
heartbreakingness of leaving his boots. for his survivors.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And then there's the plotted story. There's one of the fascinating things about, for me, in novels in general, and in this in My Antonia in particular, is the plotted narratives, the stories that are just kind of embedded in the story, that kind of stand alone. They have a standalone quality, but they also are in service of the themes of the novel as a whole. And one of them is about the tramp who jumps into the threshing machine because he's at the end of his rope, and it's gory. And but there was something in there about what it was told. That story was told in front of some very young children, and yeah, just kind of weird and fascinating.
Yeah. As you said earlier, there's a lot of violence and pain in this book, even though the I think in a lot of ways the general tone is fairly nostalgic. Jim is looking at these stories, and these stories are coming out, but what he's thinking about is how much he loved his childhood and cared about her and remembers it in this bittersweet at moments, but almost idealizing some of um, that past.
Sure, and I mean that's the sign of a deft, of a genius novelist, that they can deliver a social critique without you even realizing that it's there. Because it really, you can read this, and again, I'm relying on some professorial remarks I just watched, but you can read this as I agreed with them, but they're not my thoughts originally. That you can read this as a critique of commerce, American commerce.
Yeah,
The most commercial characters in the novel, they do not come off very well.
I think there are a
What's
lot
his
of
name?
a lot
Cutter
of
and
sort of social elements of this story and showing a fairly multicultural pattern of immigration and people who weren't just assimilating, people who were holding on to their traditions um,
absolutely.
while they were building America, and that this is a story about the new America, the creation. In fact, I have a quote from a scholar um, who called, I'm not sure I'm going to find it, says this is the feminine story of creating a female America, a female pioneer, but also a different kind of America. And that, Antonia is part of the pioneer culture, but also stressing home and family and the development of a sort of feminine aesthetic. Um, but at the same time, there are things that aren't mentioned here that I have a couple in mind. One is this is during World War One that Cather is writing, and the majority, I believe, of immigrants in this area were German, and she chooses not to mention any German immigrants, which is kind of an interesting
Yeah,
statement of was she trying
definitely.
not to upset other people? Did she not want to give people that attention? But I mean, those were people who had immigrated to America that she sort of chooses to leave out. But then, even more noticeable is that she doesn't talk about the native peoples who had lived in that area. Many of them had been pushed out a little earlier during Andrew Jackson's um, Indian removal.
There is a one reference to a circle of that they left of I'm assuming a circle of stones that was served some spiritual or some cultural function for the indigenous peoples there, but that's it. Nobody else writing novels at this time in America or Canada did either, and it's embarrassing to look back on that time in for that reason. But yes, I agree with
Right,
you.
right. I mean, she's definitely sort of buying into the rhetoric of the time of manifest destiny
Sure,
and
sure.
yeah, yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So certainly it does not make as an historian who talks about racism, the idea of saying, oh, we're not going to read this because she believed things that other writers of her time also believed seems wrong. But
stereotypes about Indigenous characters, then I might say, oh, I don't want to read this.
Right.
But their absence, it's glaring to a reader in the first quarter of the 21st century. But yeah,
Right.
no, there's no excuses, but it's just, yeah, exactly.
And recognizing what she's doing that is supporting those more conservative elements and what she's doing that is showing new openings and new and more progressive ideas is interesting.
And by valorizing the small town, even more than small town, the rural, the family life, how she is and what is her situation at the end of the novel. There's a part of me that's on comfort because it's being refracted through Jim's perspective, through a male perspective. But what did she have? A dozen kids, and not quite a ne'er-do-well husband. He was painted as being mostly positive, but some people thought he was a bit lazy or something. Um, her life couldn't have been easy, and we don't really ever see it other than her, if we can trust Jim's narrative. Not that he put a gloss on what she told him, but that she seems it doesn't like there's a lot left out of that story, is what I'm
Right.
trying to say.
Yes. Yeah, she seems fulfilled in his portrayal. Um, but she also sort of actively says, my daughters will not have to go. I'm not sure she literally says won't have to go through what I went through, but that they'll have an easier time. She recognizes that things are hard. And in fact, she recognizes things were hard when she was growing up in a way that Jim didn't, and yet he's able to report it. Let me see if I can find the. Yeah, she says to him, if you live here like you, that's different. Things will be easy for you, but they'll be hard for us.
That's
And
right.
that's early in her life, but I think it's true at the end too, that he's off in New York, as a lawyer, traveling everywhere and married to, an educated, successful woman, and she's living in a sod house with kids. And that's not what we expect from her when we read the novel, I don't think. I don't think it's what Jim expected. Um, and yet,
Unless he would be there as her husband.
although the idea that, as a white man, he would marry an immigrant, I'm not, although he certainly looks back at it at the end and considers
Yeah,
it. Actually, let me read that part because that's a weird
yeah,
passage, I think. He says to her, I think of you more often than anyone else in this part of the world. I'd like to have had you for a sweetheart or a wife or my mother or my sister, anything that a woman can be to a man. The idea of you is part of my mind. You really are a part of me. And it seems like he's looking back thinking he'd made a mistake in some way. But her response, I don't think she's responding in kind here. And she says, ain't it wonderful, Jim, how much people can mean to each other? I'm so glad we had each other when we were little. I can't wait till my little girl's old enough to tell her stories about things we used to do. I guess everybody thinks about old times, even the
yeah.
happiest people. So she puts it in the past, and he has
Definitely in the
this,
regret in the future, in the present. Yeah.
yeah, she does seem happy compared to what I think he may be feeling at that moment, too. Not just,
Oh, definitely. And that's where I think the critique of kind of commerce, and he's in the big economic system and richer than you know, as rich as they come, but he's not doesn't seem very happy.
yeah, no real relationship with his wife, it seems. No children, not that people need children to be fulfilled, but I think especially when he's with her, surrounded by her family, he feels lonely.
What did you make of Jim's like his sexuality? I don't mean that he didn't seem gay to me, but he seemed kind of almost maybe asexual. I mean, it was just weird that the way he talked about her as if he was a gay man, like the kind of emotions that a gay man would have for their girlfriends. And I'm not going any further down the road of queering him. I'm not, but he even in his teenage years, he was kind of unusually chaste and judgmental of sexuality anywhere he saw it. And I just wonder if what you did you make anything of that?
I don't know. I certainly Cather's novels have a lot of strong women and sensitive men. It's not just this book. Um, I think his relationship with Lena brings some challenges to that. That this book actually has quite
That's
a
true.
bit of actual sex in it, not always sex that seems anything other than teenagey. But I think his relationship with Lena makes me think he thought that was what to do.
Right. Yeah. No,
Um,
I need to think about that in terms of Lena as well, because there was some interesting stuff there. Maybe just very quickly, because we're drawing to this discussion to a close, but his reaction to the assault, um, people need to read the book. We won't explain everything in detail, and it would be too spoilery to explain everything. But he's sleeping in Antonia's bed at Cutter's house because she doesn't feel safe when she's left alone there. And Cutter comes back deviously to, I think we can all agree, rape Antonia. And he's in his bed and he almost starts to rape um, Jim. And Jim's reaction to that is, I mean, he was assaulted and it was scary, but there was something also extra in Jim's reaction that was described in a really intriguing way that I'm not sure what to make of.
Shame. I mean, he's
Well,
embarrassed.
definitely yes. And I think there was something about his masculinity that was mixed up in all that shame. Oh yeah, absolutely.
I agree. I agree. Yeah, I think all of the issues of sexuality in these books, sometimes subtle and sometimes not quite so subtle, are are really interesting because it's a time where ideas about sexuality are changing. Sort of the new ideas of what lesbianism meant, was changing from the more romantic friendships of 19th century to being understood as sexual identity more.
Yeah, absolutely. And as far as I'm aware, she didn't ever write any overt lesbian characters into any of her fiction. She
Not
has
that
a
I
famous,
know of so far.
no,
There are a lot of novels I haven't read yet, but I think I don't
would
think
have heard of,
that's
they would have been, we would have heard of them at
right.
least. A short story that if I read it, I don't remember anything about it, called Paul's Case, which is about a gay, a young gay man.
Although even there, it's somewhat subtle whether he's gay or not. I mean, it's hard to read it now without that, but it wasn't something that would necessarily have been something she wanted to make as clear as it now seems like it was. Could you talk just a little bit about the differences and similarities between Antonia and Lena? They give us two really different ideas about gender, about
Uh,
femininity.
Lena was like the new woman, or I'm not
Right.
sure that it's
Yeah.
exactly what the new woman was, but she was fiercely independent. She didn't want to get married. She was sexually bold in a way that Antonia wasn't. And I think that um Jim had some kind of a relationship with her when they were both living in Lincoln, and then she ended up in San Francisco after going up to the gold rush. She had a fascinating life. I would love to read a novel about her too. But she wasn't more interesting to me than Antonia, but she was kind of a counterpoint to Antonia. And I think it also showed Antonia's character because Antonia had no disapproval of of
Right.
Lena at all. And I think Jim had some at certainly at certain aspects of Lena's conduct or character. So that, yeah, those would be my thoughts.
And he was really disappointed in um, Antonia's expression of sexuality when she got
Oh,
pregnant.
absolutely.
He was very disappointed in her.
Yeah.
Although I think later he came to a very different understanding of that.
He did. He did. But he sometimes really pissed me off. Like, do you remember, again, I don't want to go too far from your question, but do you remember how angry he was at Mrs. Shimerda when he was about 8 years old? Because what was it? She was, I mean, she wasn't the most tactful woman, and there were sides to her character, but he was really, and he was criticizing him to Antonia when they were children. I didn't like him in that chapter at all. I really kind of didn't like him for a lot of this book.
Yeah. He had a pretty clear idea of hierarchy, both men over women, but also,
Absolutely.
white migrants as opposed to immigrants. Yeah,
Very much so. Very much so.
yeah,
So, and I think that Cather put him in there consciously to explore a lot of that. Yeah.
yes, yes,
So,
yeah. Do you think he's an unreliable narrator? Can we call him that?
well, I think that I don't even use that term in my reading because I just think um anybody who's telling a story, whether it's the author or a character that's telling the story, I mean, what does it mean? I mean, I think my comments about him that our discussion already is what I have to say about him. Yeah, that we're getting it through his eyes, and like anybody else, we're getting a very slanted perspective. So,
Well, what I
I
love
think
about it is that Cather is not telling us that he's wrong exactly, but she keeps giving us these hints. He even gives us hints that it's his version, and
that's
she
right.
keeps
My
reminding
Antonia,
us at moments that
my
there's some
Antonia.
hints.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Oh, well, let's do something like this again, shall we? What are you doing
That
next
would be
weekend?
wonderful.